Hi there, it's Kathy Missildine, and this week we're going to be discussing talent acquisition and retention. Just as usual, we'll be following along in your PowerPoint presentation. It's functional area number 1, and I'll be referring to the slides as we go through our discussion. So let's kind of set the context up until this week. We talked about the HR competencies, the HR structure, and then the laws and regulations, and that gave us a good background and a good foundation to be excellent HR professionals. Now we're getting into more information regarding the employee life cycle. So we're going to start with talent acquisition and retention, which are two subjects very near and dear to most of our leadership's hearts, because it's harder and harder to find good talent, and it's harder and harder to retain good talent. So we're going to start off with talking about different challenges in the staffing arena. And so most of you have probably experienced these on a daily basis. You've got changing demographics. Not only is it the usual suspects that we discussed in Title VII, but it's demographics like different generations in the workplace. So now we have about 5 generations in the workplace, and how you manage all that. The lack of skilled labor. No longer, when you're in a factory worker situation and in unskilled labor situation, now that game has been lifted to where those individuals probably need some computer skills, because the machines are no longer manually operated. They're probably operated by computers. We have the economic cycles that really presents challenges, especially like the one we just went through with the recession. We're just now unthawing from that. So I think what we're going to begin to see are employment rates that are going to be better. And so that'll encourage movement between companies. And so retention is going to be more and more of an issue. Business life cycles. So where you are in business, if you're startup, maturity, growth, decline, all that has impacts on the life cycle as far as hiring and retention. The PEST factors, P-E-S-T, you guys may not have been familiar with this, but that stands for political, economic, social, and technology. And you can read about that on page 9 of your book, the People book, that addresses retention and attraction. So you can look at that chart. It goes through each one of those areas very clearly. So those are our staffing challenges. And I like on slide 5 the definition they put around staffing: attempts to provide an adequate supply of qualified individuals to complete the body of work necessary for the organization's financial success. Because that definition for me is very proactive. So it talks about having an adequate supply. In other words, before the requisition is signed, you've got people in the pipeline that are willing and able to take that position. So I think that's really important as well. The next topic I want to discuss starts on slide 9, on slide 7, and it's this whole idea of employment branding. So I think employment branding is, I guess we've been talking about that for a decade or so. And it's just like regular branding in the marketing situation when we're talking about our services and our products. What is the competitive advantage of our service and products? And on the converse side, what is the value proposition for an employee working for your company? I'm sure in social media you've seen companies that have done excellent with their employment branding proposition. Companies that come to mind that I see sometimes on Facebook or LinkedIn, I think the Home Depot, Zappos, Amazon. A lot of those companies do a really good job of really articulating what it's like, why you should want to work for that particular company. And so the definition, again, on page 7, positions the organization as an employer of choice in the labor market. It creates a positive, compelling image of the organization. And so if you look at the best practices on slide 9, I think those are really a really good list. So what is the brand pillar identification? In other words, what are those differentiators that set you apart from other organizations. How do you use social media? What does your online presence look like as far as career portrayals and jobs? Um, how do you stack up as far as benchmarking and looking at your touch points with your candidates and employees? How do you touch them as far as an employer? Thinking about the interview process. Do you close the loop? Do you call back? All those sort of things are important. And so thinking about it from a process point of view, so, it's important to understand, what does our environment look like? What does the labor pool look like? What is our brand going to be? And then we're ready to figure out what we're going to hire for. So that's where job analysis comes in and job documentation. Job analysis is a really, really important process for HR professionals. I feel like it's kind of one of those bedrock processes that is used in so many different ways. Job analysis is basically the studying of jobs in an organization, understanding what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we need to do that job, but what are the major essential functions or tasks of those jobs. So the output of a job analysis are two things: the job description, which we're all familiar with, and the job specs. And usually those two things are combined in one document. Some time ago, I used to see them in two documents, but now I definitely see them in one document. And I think if you've gone through a job analysis, you understand the depth of information that you get as an HR professional. It really begins to crystallize, what success looks like for those jobs, what it takes to do those jobs. So it really makes recruiting a lot easier, training a lot easier, career development, performance management. Once you get that familiar with a job, a class of jobs, a department of jobs, you really begin to understand your business a lot better. And so the elements of job descriptions, that's on page 11. I'm sure we're pretty familiar, so we won't spend a lot of time on that. Job specs, just like I said, are the minimum qualifications. It includes experience, education, training, licenses. So if you think about HR director, it might say MBA preferred, SHRM SC or SCP preferred. So things like that you'll see. Now, when we're talking about job analysis, job descriptions, you also have to talk about competencies, because many companies do competency-based job descriptions. So back in the beginning of our study, the first book we looked at are all the new competencies for HR professionals that SHRM National created. And so competency, the definition is a cluster of highly interrelated attributes, including knowledge, skills, and abilities that give rise to the behaviors needed to perform a given job effectively. So that's the differentiator, is behaviors. And so that's why it was such a big deal for SHRM National to do these competencies and have this test based on competencies, because it's about behaviors on the job. So some examples, let's think about what we learned in the very first book. As HR professionals, we have the competency of business acumen, critical evaluation, relationship management, ethical practices, all those different competencies that together make an effective HR individual. So now that we have the kind of, we know what the environment brings, we have our brand, our employment brand, we've got the job documentation, we've set up expectations. Now it's time to do the sourcing and recruiting. And I feel like this is an area that most of you are real familiar with. So we're going to kind of just hit the highlights on this area, because I think most of us have been involved with hiring and sourcing of candidates. So as you can see on slides 17, 18, 19, it talks about internal and external sources of candidates. I'm pretty sure we're probably all familiar with those. And then it goes into this whole discussion about recruiting metrics. And I think they're critically important. As most of you know, there is a increased awareness and attention being put on HR metrics. We've even got that critical evaluation competency that really is geared towards that sort of skill set for HR professionals. And so when you're looking at recruiting, you're probably looking at things like, head count, cost per hire, time to fill, the different recruiting ratios that can tell us how efficient we are with the recruiting process, like on slide 25. The recruitment cost ratio, how much are we spending in regards to recruitment as it relates to salaries. And then yield ratios can tell us how efficient we are at getting candidates that are qualified in the door, how many will accept a job offer. And looking on slide 23, going back for a second, cost per hire. This is our first standard metric we have in HR. SHRM National worked on that a couple years back to get us a standard, because you can imagine companies were calculating this in many different ways, including things in the internal cost that were different than other companies, something like management time to do an interview. Some companies would include it, some would not. And so that's why a standard was needed. And so slide 23 addresses that, but if you want to see the white paper on it, you can do a Google search on that. SHRM National Cost Per Hire, and it's a white paper. It's about 11 pages long. If you're interested, you can read that. And so I really believe that, as slide 26 talks about, the workforce analytics improves vital decisions about talent and helps address workforce challenges. Think of things like turnover, whereas before we've calculated turnover kind of holistically, looking at organizational turnover. Let's say we came up with last year XYZ company had 20% turnover. Well, that's one metric, and really when you start talking about turnover, usually what management would like to know is who's leaving, why, what are we doing about it, and how much is it costing us. So really you have to get very granular when you're looking at recruiting. So when you're looking at turnover. So no longer is it good enough just to look at it overall, but really you need to kind of slice and dice until you get down to the story. So in my example of the turnover at an organizational level, start looking at it by department. Start looking at it by high performer versus non-high performer. Look at it by manager, and that starts to tell a story. Look at it by tenure. Are we losing all our new hires, between 0 and 12 months or whatever it is? So there's lots of different ways to slice and dice the data that will probably lead to more questions and finishing out that story of why we're losing folks. So I think that's really important when you're looking at HR data. And that's something that's only going to be getting more and more attention than less. Because if you think about the other departments in our organizations, they've always measured things. If you think about finance and sales and customer service and quality, we're kind of late at this game. So I see that as an area where we all need to focus in HR over the next 2 to 3 years. So let's talk about the selection process. So now we're ready to select our candidates, and that starts on slide 29. So we're going to screen them. We're going to bring them in for an interview. We're going to assess and evaluate, and then finally we're going to make a selection and the final offer. So it seems very straightforward, but there's lots of best practices in this area and lots of red flags that we need to be aware of, especially with our managers. And so when we're screening, we have a certain set of criteria that we're looking at to see, okay, this person possesses our qualifications. They meet the first kind of funnel, and we're going to bring them in for an interview. We need to remember at each step in the game, we want to be fair and consistent in the way we apply these practices, and we want to make sure our managers are trained to be fair and consistent. We don't want to have one set of criteria for one person and another set for another individual. And when lots of companies use ATS or applicant tracking software because of the sheer volume that we may get as far as job applicants, especially if we're in growth mode, that's kind of hard to manage as a manual process. And so many companies will purchase or have an applicant tracking system. So thinking about the interview process, that's where managers can get themselves into a little trouble. I bet you've had some experience with that. So I think it's really important that our managers have some guidance in this area. Number one, making sure they have a consistent set of questions, that they're not asking candidates different questions, and they're certainly not asking candidates questions, kind of off the cuff, because that's where they'll get in trouble and start asking illegal things like, are you married and how many children do you have? So we don't want them to do that at all. So looking at the slide on page 36, I think that's a good one to looking at interview guidelines, and something that you could also share with managers is becoming familiar with the position duties, be prepared to answer general questions about the company, the history, the strategy, formulate your questions or have an interview guide for the consistency in questions. Make sure, obviously, that we've reviewed the candidate's resume or application. We want to establish rapport, and we definitely want to listen because we want to hear what the candidate says. And if we're doing all the talking, that's not going to be possible. We want to observe nonverbal behavior, but we don't want to use that as a bias, or we don't want to not select somebody because of nonverbal behavior. Let's say they I've seen this with women all the time, that they might mess with their hair a lot during an interview process. Well, are we not going to hire that person because she messes with her hair, but she's otherwise qualified? Probably not. So looking at interview biases, I think, is another area where, excuse me, we as HR professionals and managers can get sidetracked. So looking on slide 39, there's 9 different biases that we can bring to the table when we're interviewing candidates. And so I think the way to mitigate these is to be aware of these. And so that's where I think when we're training our managers to be supervisors, that we need to make sure that they're aware of these. So looking at, let's see, inconsistency in questioning. We talked about having structured interview guides so that managers ask the same question to every candidate in the same type of job. The halo or horn effect. So we may look at a candidate and see one positive that we really highlight, and we don't consider other factors. So perhaps maybe one halo effect would be that the person worked for a competitor in a similar position, and then we let that kind of outshine the rest of the interview questions or characteristics. Similar to me, we're human. We bring these biases, and we just have to be aware. So perhaps somebody was a KSU graduate or an Auburn graduate, and I might give them preferential treatment because they're similar to me, and that definitely is a no-no. So when we're going through these interviewing questions in the selection process, we want to keep everything job related. So if you think about questions, is it job related to ask somebody if they're married? Is it job related to ask somebody how many children they have? Is it job related to ask about religion? Absolutely not. So that's what we have to keep in mind. So the next step is looking at how do we assess and evaluate. We might do some pre-employment screenings, such as different testing, personality tests, cognitive tests, assessment centers. We might do some drug tests, and if it's job related, we might do medical exams. We also could do some cultural type of assessments to see if this person is going to fit in culturally, because we know that's a real issue. If we've got a growth-oriented, entrepreneurial type of culture, and we're interviewing someone that is more rigid, someone that needs more supervision, they might not fit in with our culture. So slide 41 talks about different assessments you can use for kind of cultural fit. And, I have used some of those in the past, and I think they're helpful, but what we want to remember is we don't want that to be our number one driver of how we select someone. We want to take that as another data point along with their experience, how well they did in the interview, and any other pre-screening tools we've used. Now, we can't talk about pre-screening tools or assessments unless we talk about 2 very important constructs, or 2 important ideas regarding testing, and that's reliability and that is validity. Now, those are on slide 43 and 44. So, reliability is the ability of an instrument to measure consistently over time. So time and reliability are heavily related in this definition. So let's think about our SHRM CP and our SHRM SCP test. We want it to be reliable, correct? If we took the test, and we were still at the same level of preparation, if we took the test in July, we want to score similarly if we took the test in December with the same amount of preparation. So you know where I'm going with that. We want it to be reliable over time. And at the same time, the next concept is validity. Does it measure what it's intended to measure? The SHRM CP and the SHRM SCP are measuring the competencies and the body of knowledge for HR. Do we want that? Do we want our test to be valid? Absolutely. And so there's different ways to test these two concepts. So I think that's the best example to keep those concepts straight in your mind. Reliability is time. Validity is it testing what it should be testing? And so I think those are two concepts that I have found that come up several times in the material in the learning and development phase as well. We'll talk about that again. So the last step is we're going to make the selection and we're going to make the offer. And so, excuse me, so I think it's really important as far as our selection criteria and our applicant tracking flow data is making sure that we can show that we've made a decision based on job relatedness and the best fit. So it brings everything together to be able to evaluate the candidates. And I'm on slide 47. I do believe you need to document results. The selection process yields a pool of qualified candidates, not just one. And here's the decision process down on slide 48. Organize and summarize the information in terms of our criteria. Identify and rank acceptable candidates. Collect additional information as necessary, and then make the offer to the top candidate. Or if you have multiple positions, the top however many, 1, 2, or 3. So if you've got a structured interview guide, think about this that I was talking about for our managers that allow us to ask the same questions to every candidate. And you have some sort of scoring mechanism. In other words, this type of answer receives 3 points. This type of answer receives 2, and a no answer obviously is 0 points. And we can score those in a more objective way. It gives more meat in case we have to defend our selection criteria, and we may have to if a candidate feels like they were not treated fairly. They could make claims against our selection process, and then we would have to defend those. So the more documentation, unfortunately, you have, and the more consistent and fair process you have, the better chance you have at defending that practice. And so there's different kinds of job offers. We've got the contingent. It could be contingent on passing a background check, something like that. I think you could make a job offer that could be either oral or written. Obviously, I'm in the camp of put everything in writing, then there's no question about what the offer states and what we've agreed to do and not do. And then finally, a contract. These are more prevalent when we are at the executive level, or if we're making a special employment arrangement, we would use a contract. So let's talk about retention, and I believe retention begins with selection or with recruiting, because candidates get a feel, again, for your brand and how it is to work around here by how they were treated in that process. So I want you to think about your own recruiting process when you have candidates that are phone screened. Do you give them the outcome of that? Either they're going through or they're not, or do you leave them hanging? So you really have to think about that. The definition of retention on slide 52 is the ability to keep talented employees in the organization. It's just that simple. How do we keep talent engaged? And, like I was talking about before, looking at talent, it's not a one-size-fits-all game anymore. If you think about your own workplaces and how even different generations, how they're engaged. The baby boomers, they're not engaged by the same things the millennials are coming in. So it's really important to think about what motivates your top performers, what keeps them in your workplace, and how you can provide some of those things to those employees. And so, I love it on slide 54 when they talk about retention initiatives, orientation, and onboarding. There's a lot of of focus on onboarding right now because of that reason. We used to get people in, set them in the chair, give them a computer. Maybe they have a phone, maybe they don't. Show them the restroom and tell them to get busy, right? Well, that's not a real effective onboarding strategy. You have to think about things like, how do they get oriented into the culture? How do they know how things really get done around here? Because sometimes those are not in a policy or procedure, and I'd say most of the time they're not. So now companies are spending a lot more time using some really cool technology to get people engaged, get people productive in a shorter period of time. So I think you have to really look at your onboarding processes to make sure they're focused on the employee and not just, getting forms done. Slide 55 goes into some other retention practices. Have we set clear expectations up front? Because if you think about it, employees want to know what's expected. That's just human nature. And if we don't do a good job there, they're not going to be focused on what needs to get done. Clear and fair supervision. There comes that word fair again. Are we being treated the same? Training and development. Am I exercising my need for more knowledge, more information? Do I have the resources to do my job? Are there growth and promotional opportunities that I can see and understand, and I understand what I need to do to get there? Do I get enough recognition? Do I have respect? And is there a perception of equity? Again, that's very tied with fairness and consistency in the workplace. And so those are very important concepts when motivation is concerned. And so finally, when you're looking at evaluation in some of these practices, obviously with retention, you're looking at turnover rates, absenteeism rates. What has turnover been doing historically? Is it getting better? Same thing with onboarding. If we're losing a lot of folks after 6, 12, 18 months, something's not exactly right. So begin asking yourself questions then. So that was the section on talent acquisition and retention. Again, if you have any questions, please post it in this week's forum, and I'll be happy to answer those. Thank you, and have a good rest of the week.